And before I introduce the third speaker, so discussion will take place immediately after Frits Palmboom presentation. And then also, I think the bar, as you know, is open upstairs, and there will be food if you want to eat inside the AA. So Frits Palmboom. Frits has studied architecture, urban design, and town planning at Delft. And he was a designer in the team responsible for the Prinsenland district in Rotterdam, which I think is one of the most interesting inner city recent development in Holland. And in 1990, he started his own office, Palmboom and Van den Bout, Urban Design. And it is based in Rotterdam, and I think it's fair to say that he is one of the busiest and most influential urban designer in Holland at the moment, with work in almost every key VINEX location. There is, of course, IJ-burg to the east of Amsterdam, and there is IJ-burg to the south of The Hague, and Leidse Rijn near Utrecht. Also, Frits is an academic, and he teaches at various universities, and he has a number of publications. In 1979, he published a book on constructivism and de-urbanism, and more recently, in 1987, he has published a book on Rotterdam, which traced the evolution of Rotterdam from landscape to city. So, Frits.
Even kijken welke. This is the microphone. Ja. Good. After the lectures by Nout de Vreese and Arnold Reindorp, I would like to concentrate my contribution on the concepts and the tools we as designers are working with on some VINEX projects. We are actually working on 3 VINEX projects, rather huge, but not on all of them. I'm lucky about that. But before, I want also to make a statement about the relation between change and tradition. Maybe this will be a kind of running gag through the different lectures. Can I have the slides, please? Maybe we have an old problem, but I think in a very new context. Next 2 slides, please. Oh, moet ik het zelf doen? Ja. I want to remind 3 rules, so to say, that were very dominant in the Dutch post-war town planning. The first rule, so to say, is a preoccupation with the city as a concentric architectonic unity, clearly visible in the flat and open landscape. And the satellite city and the finger city were the ideal models of this. Always extensions of the city related to a traditional centrality. The second rule, next please, is the close connection between town planning and housing, defining the shape of the city by ruling the shape of the housing. In a composition of streets and blocks, like the Berlage projects, or later on, in a composition of slabs and green spaces, as in the Bakema schemes. Next, please. The third rule is a supposed close connection between social order and spatial order. In the post-war neighborhood unit, both were based on a system of concentric circles, going from the individual in the heart to the city as a whole. This was a very general scheme for a rather homogeneous society. Although all these rules are under big pressure now, also Arnold Reindorp told about that, the spatial concept of VINEX is still partially based on those three rules. And then I mean especially the concept of the compact city, its emphasis on a traditional centrality, the monomatic concentration on housing, and the typological homogeneity of the building program of the VINEX. There is a general rule that in most of the VINEX locations, 85% of the houses should be built as low-rise houses, mainly in the terraced houses, or twee onder één kap, two houses under one roof, in a density of about 40 dwellings a hectare. Within the professional field of architects and urban designers, also the criticism of these rules has a long tradition. Next, please. On the right slide, Guy Debord showed already in the 50s in his situationist maps of Paris how our perception of big cities is not homogeneous but fragmented. And Christopher Alexander, in his younger years, showed how the different domains of social life are not organized in a concentric way, but in a rather unpredictable, complex and overlapping way, as shown on the left slide. Next, please. In an indirect way, Koolhaas' book Delirious New York has been of vital significance. Koolhaas is not interested in projecting an ideal model in advance. He views in his book the existing metropolis, including all its contradictions, its hidden dynamics, and its banality through unmoralistic eyes. He revealed metropolitan congestion as a positive strength, as the engine that powers contemporary urban culture. And I think these ideas mark a true paradigmatic turning point. Nevertheless, his observations cannot be translated directly into the Dutch situation. The Randstad is no Manhattan. So many studies and projects of the last 10 years can be seen as a search for a specific quality peculiar to the Dutch metropolis, in which the landscape always plays an important role. Next, please. Willem-Jan Neutelings, in his patchwork metropolis analysis, showed how the clear opposition of city and landscape is disappearing. On the right slide, you see the black and white scheme. Black should be city and white is countryside. And on the drawing right of it, he shows how both are composed of a kind of patchwork of different functional and spatial patterns. Next, please. I myself made in my book on Rotterdam an analysis of the city as a superposition of three different layers. I will not explain it now, but the most important thing is that all these patterns or layers overlap and shift to produce continually alternating relationships between the layers. There is no question of an unequivocal hierarchy. The result is the abundance of unexpected combinations and confrontations. Next, please. As can be seen on these slides. On the left slide, you see really in the middle of the city, one of the oldest layers of the landscape, the old peat landscape, just at the surface, while at the horizon, you see the modern city. And on the right slide is a kind of symbol for the sudden meeting of the scale of the sea and the harbor and the scale of the city. The city no longer assumes the form of a homogeneous architectonic entity, but that of a heterogeneous urbanized landscape. It is from this conceptual background and with this researching attitude that we are working on the VINEX operation. And the challenge to us is to develop a conceptual interpretation of the VINEX commissions that breaks through the VINEX conceptual constraints, defined as it is by this homogeneity of the building program and by this idea of the compact city. I will show two projects. One is the IJ-burg project in Amsterdam. In that project we conceptually concentrated on the demontage, is dat een Engels woord? Yeah? Of the finger city. And if there is time enough, I will show also something about the IJ-burg project near The Hague, in which we conceptually concentrated on expanding a stretched network in a fragmented suburban environment. In both cases, we concentrated on making an architecture of artifacts in the landscape, including the traffic infrastructure, the open spaces, the water system. Artifacts in the landscape that precede any idea of the built architecture. The difference between the IJ-burg project and the IJ-burg project is that IJ-burg is a rather exceptional in the VINEX operation. The density of the IJ-burg project is twice as high as the mediocre density in other VINEX locations. So it also challenges to develop new urban typologies. The Hague IJ-burg project is has more this mediocre density, and there the challenge is to reinterpret and to perfect the existing suburban typology of row houses and terraced houses. Next slides, please. This is the site of the Amsterdam IJ-burg project. It's a very special site because at this moment it's only water. I show here the eastern docklands where Arnold Reindorp was talking about. They are just at the other side of the dike between the IJ and the real inner sea of the IJmeer. So you can see this project as a part of a tradition to reclaim land for urban expansion, just as 100 years ago when they built those eastern docks for industrial purposes. Its location, oh, that is, yeah, thank you. The location for this VINEX area, which consists of 18,000 dwellings, is defined by the VINEX rule to build close to the city center with good connections to existing infrastructure. This is the city center, here is the site, here is the ring road. So it has been very much discussed about because it's one of the VINEX, the few VINEX sites that is really close to a city center. But at the same time, it's a kind of a natural area with a lot of environmental values. So there has been an enormous political discussion about this project. Maybe later on in the discussion we can talk about this. I will not do that now. Next two slides, please. At the same time, the site is a kind of rediscovery of the Pampas project from the 60s, by Jaap Bakema on the right slide. And it is also an echo of the finger city model, which ruled all the extensions of Amsterdam from the 30s, from the plan of, by Van Eesteren. And here Bakema proposed a fifth or sixth finger. Also a way of extending the city with always maintaining the traditional orientation of the old center. All those finger city models colonized the water from the city and left the water as a kind of residual form. Next, please. When we started working on this project, this was one of our main discussion themes, because the water as it is now has a very beautiful form and a very beautiful atmosphere, almost defined by its contour, with its base and spits that evokes the infinity at the horizon at every place. Next two. Besides, there are a lot of intriguing hidden handicaps in this water plane. At the bottom there is the so-called oergeul, a very deep trench in the subsoil, a trace of a glacial riverbed from prehistoric times. And it is impossible to make any land, to create any land on top of it. And on the right slide you see how the water as a kind of fluid body is constantly flowing, depending on the direction of the wind. It is not a tidal situation. And depending on the direction of the wind, the level of the water is lowering or heightening. While at the other side, we should avoid to make any stagnant base where the water should stand still, because then the water quality is going down. So you can imagine that this is not just an urbanist project, but it has a very close connection to the technique of making land, but also to the technique of environmental, well, how you deal in an environmentally responsible way with it. And next to, the clue of the design for our IJ-burg is the concept of the archipelago. Not to make one dike on forehand and exclude the water and then make a traditional city on land on it, but to conceive the new part of the city as a group of islands in the water, to increase the contact between land and water, and by doing so to facilitate compactness and density on the islands, just as in the eastern docklands the density can be very high because there is very much contact with open space on the water around, and also to facilitate a variety of urban and natural environments on the different islands, also in a kind of analogy with the eastern docklands that were also a source of inspiration to us. Next, please. The first layer of the design is the configuration of land and water, with its own motives and with its own architecture, so to say, of dikes, quays, bridges, and so on. The islands create each other leewardness. The two islands at the outside are a kind of golfbreaker. They break the waves and they create a leewardness on the bay in which also this deep trench of the oergeul is integrated, while at the same time the composition of islands guarantees the transparency, the visual but also the ecological transparency between the leeward parts of the water and the more rough sides of the water. Next, please. The differences between the raw and the leeward side is reflected in the difference of the land-water boundaries, the robust dikes and quays at the northern side with long lines of trees on it, and the gradual transition from land to water on the south with the beach and the reedlands over here. Here you see the study of all the different profiles of land-water situations. Next, please. The bridges are the crucial detail, so to say, in the whole project. And here you see how we searched for a kind of, how shall I say, to prevent the plan from getting a dominant direction, looking like an extension of something different, to make it look like really islands floating in the water. Next two. In comparison with the original Finger City concept, two things are very important. The first thing is that we created a double orientation of the project to the existing city and the region, not only to the old city center of Amsterdam, but also to the new areas, the Schiphol area, and the new areas around along the ring road and the main public transport lines where a lot of economic activity is going on. And the second thing is that we defined in the landscape design sites for programs that exceed the traditional housing-oriented services like the obligatory shops and schools and so on. A harbor, a beach, new natural areas, a high-density development on the point where we meet the ring road, and a very low-density development, two sites at the extremities of the plan, which have to exploit their quality as isolated and lonely areas. We should like to have once a cemetery on one of those points. They give the suburban project a meaning for the region as a whole. Next, please. After this configuration of land and water, there is the urban structure on the islands as a second layer in the plan. Again, the contrast between the raw and the leeward side is the main theme. Next, please. In the landscape form, we looked for this dramatic or dynamic form in which islands look like floating in the water. In the urban structure, we looked for very simple forms to try to organize transparency, neutrality, and accessibility here by means of a shifted grid of roads and water lines. This aim for transparency, neutrality, and accessibility is also inspired by the things Arnold Reindorp told about. If the city should offer a lot of modules to make your own lifestyle, it's very important that the city as a whole has a kind of transparency that makes it possible to combine things and to understand how different modules are related to each other. Next, please. So now I'm talking about the first island we will develop. On this island, as a result of this shifted grid structure and the contrast between the raw and the leeward side, there are 4 zones in the plan: a maritime zone, as we call it, a more introvert zone behind, a zone with so-called urban parcels along the main artery, and the reed islands at the leeward side. And I want to tell something about how we think about the transition from this urban design to the architectural projects. Next. Our main idea is to develop a kind of strategy of occupation, as we call it. This is a kind of sketch of it. Here you see the main structure with a kind of indications about the areas that are in between the main lines, and here the buildings are suggested as a kind of things that are hanging above the main urban scheme as a possibility. And we as urban designers try to define a kind of mediator or interface between the scale of the network that orients to the urbanized landscape as a whole, and the possibility to articulate private or collective domains on the scale of the architectural project. We think that each architectural project should be located in this field of tension. Also to prevent this flavor of gated communities. Next, please. And I will show some drawings about how we think about this interface. Here you have the boulevard at the northern side, where the facade is the mediator between the very public, the very private and individual domain, and the very collective and public domain at its greatest scale. So here we propose a kind of architectonic intervention to mediate between those two scales. While at the southern side of this island, with the Reed Islands, with its lower density and its gradual transition from land to water, it's just the regulation of the shoreline and the regulation of the landings that mediate between the two scales. Next, please. Here we show something about a more introvert area in the middle of the island, where the main pattern of lines, of paths and green areas defines rather huge blocks in which an enormous variety of public-private relationships can be designed. Here we do some suggestions from the individual house to the group of houses that can get a place in that area. Next. And along the main traffic area, we define so-called urban parcels with a rather untraditional measure of 80 meters that makes it possible to create rather big blocks in which dwellings and services can be integrated, and a kind of intimacy near the main artery can exist. Next. In this map, the main lines of this occupation strategy are summarized, the structure and dimensions of the shifted grid, and here the programs of the different parts are summarized. Next. About the realization of the project, there are negotiations with 3 consortia of building companies, developers, and housing corporations working together. They want to realize projects on a rather big scale. At the same time, the municipality wants to have a guarantee of those companies participating and investing in the project, because, of course, the government has to make an enormous investment to create the land on forehand. The interesting thing is that the land is government-owned. It's just water. So the land costs a lot of money, but to make the land costs a lot of money, but the property of the land doesn't cost anything. That's the reason that we can realize this project at all, because otherwise it would be just impossible. But in a sense, to realize this initial investment, private parties and public parties are condemned to each other. These 2 drawings are almost the clue of the contract that there is made between government and developers. Here is defined that the government, the municipality, will develop the main structure of the shifted grid and will make all the edges of the water, so also all those technical constructions on the land-water situation are in the hands of the municipality, while the consortia will develop the houses and the public spaces in the black areas. Let me have a look. Next. For the government part, the main structure, there is a very elaborated design for the public space, guided by Michael van Gessel. Next. For the building part, we added some rules concerning the physical and material interrelation of the quay, the level of the ground, and the base of the facade, a kind of fold on the public space that is een hechtingsvlak. Noem je dat nou toch? Een hechtingsvlak. Well, you understand, I hope, by the drawings. Yeah. In this way, we want to provoke a kind of subtle or hidden architectural coherence in the project as a whole, without prescribing a fixed architectonic form or style. Next. And our challenge to the architects is to play with the contour and to make the buildings rising up from the water. Next. If we talk about a change in tradition, I would emphasize that in the approach to urban design, I think there is an enormous change and a very necessary change. I think this unbroken unity between architecture and urban design of the Bakema plan is a way that is impossible. And I like to compare the two presentations. Here we have a drawing of the plan, which is not just a flat drawing. It shows something of a third dimension, but it's the third dimension of the structures in the landscape. And that's what in that sense, I have the opinion that urban design or town planning is not just the creation of conditions for architecture and programs, as Rem Koolhaas more or less says, but I think the urban design or landscape design has an architectonic dimension of its own without being architecture in the traditional sense of buildings. This is my story about IJ-burg. I see that I have 5 more minutes. What shall I do? I can try to show you something of the IJ-burg project. Yes? Okay. Yes. So sometimes I will show just slides, and I hope you will get an impression of it, at least. Next. IJ-burg is near The Hague, and that's a region that has a very strong suburban tradition of its own. It's hardly a real city like Amsterdam. It's a kind of urbanized pattern of villages. Next. The site is at the very periphery of this suburban region, with the heart of The Hague about here. And it's surrounded by highways at 3 sides, enormous barriers to the existing city. And it's also subdivided within 3 different municipalities that wanted to claim this VINEX area for themselves. This situation of the project is one of the reasons that I really put a big question mark by this compact city ideology, because you can say it's a part of the city, but at the same time it's also very far away from the city, and it is already part from other cities in the region. Next. The interesting thing that there are some landscape features that are running through this subdivision of municipalities. Next. And we picked these lines up to escape from this subdivision and to articulate the scale of the site as a whole. This is about 2.5 kilometers. Next. Here existing and new lines are integrated in a kind of framework of traffic and water lines. That is the backbone of the whole project, with here a suggestion of the landscape architectonic expression of it. Next. This network, this framework has the task to integrate the project on the regional scale and to jump over the highways. And the second task is to organize again this transparency and accessibility of the whole area. Next. And here again we tried to give this framework on a large scale a very specific architectonic form without building any building. Next. Within this framework, certain fields can be defined, each with a different atmosphere and with a different program regarding the relation or the proportions of gardens, buildings, public space, green space, and water. Next. And we produced for each field a kind of, well, it's not a kind of master plan, but a set of guidelines with a rather some general guidelines with a very precise program. And here, for example, we have the most traditional suburban part, in which we plead for a kind of building block without the traditional hierarchy of corners and row houses in between, and in which we plead for a kind of casual continuity of the street pattern in an attempt to de-hierarchize the traditional idiom of the garden city. Next. This is a project by Gerst and Schulze, who introduced rather big measures of the block, allowing a contrasting world and a secondary network running through the blocks. Next. This is another part in which the management of the water is the main theme, in which we, in the guidelines, proposed a pattern of water lines. Here, a project by Erna van Sambeek and Jeroen van Schoten is elaborated, and here a project by MVDRV. Well, next please. These are some drawings by Erna van Sambeek, who looked for a kind of hoe zeg je dat? Samenvatten, summarizing, to escape from the recognizable repetition of the individual houses, to concentrate on the issue of the skin in relation to the level of the ground. Next. And she made some very intriguing proposals to make the skin as a kind of layer all over one of those islands. So every island gets its own recognizability. Next. This is the project by MVDRV. We also did some very intriguing manipulations of the traditional row house type in escaping from the hierarchy of the start and the end of the row, and looking for a kind of aleatoric composition. Next. With also a kind of different relationships between the private domain and the public domain, and the place where you can park cars. A very intriguing carpet of hedgerows and houses scattered around. Next. And this is another set of guidelines for another part of the plan, in which this, especially the pattern and the profile of very narrow paths with hedges along, which tends to give the whole area a rather informal atmosphere and a very strong orientation analogous to the landscape pattern. Next. And here, Sean Kandekar and Faro architects manipulated the program not as a program of about 600 individual houses, but as a program of 124 landhuizen estates. So they, next please. Next. Especially by playing with the roof as a kind of autonomous thing that summarizes the repetition of the houses and that makes, in fact, every individual house, although it starts with a pattern of repetition, to an individual thing. Next. Well, this is the end of my story. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I would like to thank all the three speakers for really doing a great job of setting the scene in terms of both the current situation and its historical background. I think it's really important to open the conversation up as soon as possible. But just before we do that, I would like to maybe ask three questions which relate to all the presentations. There were issues that were raised, I think, in all the three presentations, in order to just really get the conversation now to be more specific in terms of what we can learn from the presentations. In his book, Metropolis and Mental Life, Jörg Simmel wrote somehow a very beautiful piece that was about the relationship between the individual and the metropolis, and how the idea of being in a kind of urban condition of the metropolis, the individual could simultaneously be part of the crowd and also be, in a sense, an individual. And I think this became very clear in Arnold's presentation, when I think he touched very beautifully on this issue in terms of the clarification of the idea of the individuality of the architectural project versus the notion of being an individual in some way. And this topic of the link or the connection between the collective and the individual, the relationship between urbanism and the suburb, and the degree to which this topic of the collective and the individual is somehow presented, I think is all the speakers, I think, touched on that particular issue. What I think would be interesting is to hear you now more specifically. I think again, for example, in the last presentation, there were very specific hints that were given about this particular topic. But what do you see as the most sort of significant contributions or ways that we could begin to think about this issue of the collective and the individual when you're dealing with the topic of suburban developments? Because it seems to me that it touches on many of these topics, like, for example, the question of density, of the intensity that is available. When you don't have that kind of density, how do you reconcile the individual with the collective if you're not going to only do it at the level of architectural representation? That's sort of my first question. My second question would be on the role of collaboration that I think all of you touched on. Nod somehow in his first, who made the first presentation, suggested that this collaboration is now a collaboration between the architect, the client, and the construction company, and somehow made it seem like such a wonderful, easy thing that happens in the Netherlands, and it's really a very meaningful and in a sense easy collaboration. I'm sure he didn't mean to make it seem so easy, but I have also been told that the collaboration really involves a greater number of parties in some way. I think it would be good to touch more specifically on this issue of collaboration. What happens? Which are the parties that are involved? And what is the dynamics of this particular collaboration and its impact on the architectural or urban developments? And my last question before we open the discussion up would be to ask again to have more comments on the nature of transformation, the nature of change. I think again, Nod at the beginning suggested that there wasn't anything that radical about the developments over the last 10 or 15 years, that this was something that was part of a kind of history of urban development in Holland. But I think I got the impression at least that somehow both Arnold and Frits believed that there had been major transformations. Specifically, I think it would be very interesting if Frits could elaborate on the last, towards the end, you started articulating this distinction between architecture and urbanism, and somehow your proposal that the relationship is no longer that of urbanism setting up the scene, of the staging, of developing the staging for the architectural project, but now we are really, we should think about urbanism or urban development or urban design as something that has a kind of identity in its own right, independent of its role as something that really sets the scene for the architectural project. So if you could really say something more about what you see as the most significant aspect of change, of transformation that has happened or is happening in Holland. I think those, maybe if we start with those three questions, and I
for the rest of the afternoon.
For the next 5 minutes, and then no, and then we will take it further. Who would? Arno, why don't you start?
Yeah, to begin, maybe I can begin. Easiest to begin with your last question. I think that the nature of the changes has to do with the game we are playing in urban planning and in architecture with each other, with different participants. And I think that we are playing a totally different game nowadays than 10 or 15 years ago. Maybe we were, if that's a play you have in England, Goose Board. Is that a play you recognize? No. No, it's a play you can also play with very little children. And I think we are now, the play we are now playing is more like Monopoly or Strategio, or a more sophisticated kind of play that is has to do with very complicated situations and very complicated participation of different participants and different roles that are in the play. So it's maybe that now is right. That is very much. There's very much rhetoric in speaking about enormous changes, and it's mostly on. He's right, I think, on the political level and etc. But I think in the practice of urban planning and architecture, the changes are very fundamental. The next question is also.
No, let's just go keep with that.
Do this
because no one would go, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I react on that?
Sure.
You asked about the nature of transformation, and what I tried to explain was that the images of Adriaan Geuze in his NAE exhibition with these wooden blocks, you have seen the slides of it, is really has nothing to do with reality. And I can prove that by asking your attention for the other map that was shown, I think, 2 times, the official VINEX map with the circles. These circles are rather big, but inside of these circles are these very small, tiny red spaces, and that's what we are talking about. In this big whole country, we're talking about very small things. So the nature of transformation in the image of Adriaan Geuze, that the whole country is going to be suburbia as a result of VINEX, has nothing to do with reality. That's my point of view. There's another thing, and that is that there is a change from the image of central cities, like Frits Palmboom talked about, towards more kind of zoned cities with a kind of agglomerational form, cities growing together in a kind of big zoning systems of city identity. But still in that zoning system at this moment, you have to be aware of the fact that there is still a very important difference between urban areas with an urban character, and the more rural landscape-like areas and the in-betweens of suburbia. These 3 types really exist, like they existed in the 30s or in the 19th century. They still exist. If you look at the attention of policy making on the local level, the policy making in central cities is completely different from policy making in suburbia areas, and that's completely different from policy making in landscape rural areas. So these 3 identities for physical environment, they still exist. Nothing is changing on that level.
Well, I don't completely agree with you now, because I think what intrigues me in my also in my study about Rotterdam is that there are very fast changes, and at the same time there are things very slowly, very traag. And you can say that the range of rhythms is widening, because things are at the top are going faster. So I think the big mistake is to only put emphasis on the fact that an urban culture is spreading with its character. With speed and velocity. At the same time, there are a kind of hidden systems that are still very slow and are still very traditional. And I think the challenge is to think about the correlation or the interrelation of those systems. And that interrelation has become more complex, and that is a new task, I think, for us. One very important thing is that, of course, I also experience in my own practice that the way of policy making in the city, in the suburban and the countryside are quite different. But the patterns, the physical and spatial patterns in which those three atmospheres are organized have changed very much. You could, 30 years ago, you could still draw a map of the Netherlands following the Christeller pattern of hierarchy of cities, suburbs and countryside on the basis of a kind of decentralized, concentric pattern. Nowadays it has fundamentally changed, so there is a challenge for the professional field to think about those new patterns and compositions on a map and how to deal with them. Because I'm really surprised that this concentric thinking is so persistent, while the criticism on the social content of those concentric schemes is already 40 years old. There is a kind of block in the head of many architects and planners to think about those new patterns. And then the thing about the rhetoric about the 1 million houses, well, in a sense it is very rhetoric. But I think Adriaan Geuze revealed something which is very important, because in the VINEX this task to build all those houses is broken in very little parts and is in a very detailed way dotted on the map. You 400 houses, you 18,000 houses, you and so on and so on. And the tasks
Frits,
are formulated on the level of the individual municipalities, and the result is enormous fragmentation. So the thing Adriaan revealed, that there is a dimension of big number in the whole operation that is put out of sight by the technique of the VINEX operation, and that is terrible, because if I showed for the IJ-burg project in the Hague, where we tried to make this stretched network to stretch over the highways, the enormous fights that you meet when you try to cross a highway are incredible, while in my opinion especially those things are very crucial if we want to give our suburbs a kind of urban meaning. I think in the building program it is a suburban program, and maybe that's a thing that belongs to this society at this moment. So I also don't link urbanity too strong to high density. I think urbanity has very much to do with those things I said, the transparency, the neutrality, and the accessibility of a suburban area. If it's 10 houses a hectare or 80 houses a hectare, of course it makes a difference, but the most fundamental condition for a flavor of urbanity within our spreading metropolis has to do with those three words.
No, do you wanted to respond to that? No. Okay. Do you want to pick up any of the other questions, or I mean, I think you've touched on some of them. But for example, now on this issue of the collective and individual, the degree to which, for example, this also relates to the connection between the social project, the projects done by the government, and the projects done, for example, by private initiative, and the relationship between these individual houses versus, for example, apartment buildings or other forms of kind of collective construction. Is there an issue there that you could
Well, the issue in this field of debate might be the question of what you can call appreciation of city life. That has been in the Netherlands for the last 100 years a discussion. Is there an anti-urban or urban stimulating policy, one or the other? And in my experience, there is the last few years a growing appreciation of urban living conditions. I'm not sure, I don't base this on research or interviews or things like that. It might be a kind of personal preoccupation, but I have a feeling that also, let's say, private enterprise, investing companies, that they more and more have trust in city-like, urban-like circumstances to invest. And in the Netherlands, this might be the result of an explicit policy. We had a state secretary the last 4 years who was responsible for big city problems, just big city as a political issue, as a political program. Was part of an explicit national program. And in years before, in the 70s, we had an enormous program for urban renewal. I think more than most Western European countries, which are not for 100%, but quite successful in the reappreciation of city conditions. So in terms of individual and more collective living conditions, I think the urbanity has a growing support.
Yeah, on the point of urbanity and suburbia, what you told about Simel, that's one perspective on urbanity. You know, of course. And I think that mainly in the discussion you can see that there are three concepts of urbanity. There's still a concept that's linked to the small town. People have links with town. The generations are growing up there in that town. They are linked to each other, and they feel they have a kind of solidarity with each other. That's a kind of urbanity you see in sometimes in politics. The whole discussion over divided and undivided cities has something to do with what have people to do with each other in a town. The second one, I think the second view on urbanity is more the urbanity on the big industrial cities. The cities of the 19th century and the beginning of this century, and that's the view of Simel. With the very in this view they underline the city as a public space, as a space of where you can encounter each other, and where it's a dynamic, a cultural dynamic, etc. And the last one, I think, is the post-industrial, postmodern vision on the urbanity. In fact, they say the other visions, the other perspectives are mainly negative in their appreciation of modern life, modern urban life, and postmodern visions. That there is an urbanity, but the urbanity is of different kinds than the other two. And the strange thing is that what I observe in my own research in suburbs is that these views, this different perspective on urbanity, are not only in the books of intellectuals or in the heads of architects and politicians, but also in the heads and in the souls of the people that live there. So what you see is that you have not one perspective on urbanity in an urban area or in a suburban area, but people try to realize their ideas over urbanity on certain places. And what I said in my lecture, they are more and more gatherers and hunters of specific places, and on a large scale they make their own urbanity. And these urbanities, these different urbanities, they interfere with each other. And that's the interesting thing, I think, on the level of urban planning. That's not the absolute. Of course, Nout is right, there are differences between the inner city and the outskirts of the city and the areas between the outskirts of the cities. But in the ideas of people that are only places that form part of their own urbanity. And so, I think that suburbs have always been seen as, in terms of lack of urbanity, lack of public life, lack of public space, lack of heterogeneous, homogeneous populations, etc. And I think that's no longer true. That's no longer true. Also, the new suburbs are in a very dense, populated city as the Netherlands, with a planning system that doesn't allow people to go living where they want. That's the fact. That you see the creation of environments, or maybe you should say of atmospheres, that attract very different peoples. And that's the case in the Oostelijk Havengebied, that's the case in IJ-burg, I think. IJ-burg will attract people who like to live in the city, and also will attract people who like to live in the suburbs. And maybe they live next to each other. So, I don't know if that's an answer to your question, otherwise.
I'll come back. There is still the question of collaboration, but I think maybe that will come out later on when we open the thing up. I wonder, Dominic, do you at this point want to make any kind of observation from?
I mean, this discussion is very interesting for me because I've got an Anglo-Dutch company, so that I'm British, but working in my office is in the Netherlands, and I'm living in England and the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. I mean, there's obviously quite a lot that I'd like to touch upon, but I think one of the things is that going back to Noord de Vrees's comment on Adriaan Geurze, I think the point for me about that, and actually the polemical aspect of that, as a sort of a one-liner intervention in the NAE, was not so much the, what does 1 million houses look like together in one space, but the fact that just the aspect of the 1 million homes, and the sense that we are no longer looking at the post-war suburb in which it was through mainly population growth that produced the suburbs, or the proliferation of the suburbs. But no, what's happening now is this change in lifestyle that Arnold Reindorp is talking about. Is going to change very much the way our landscapes are figured. And I think it's not necessarily what the whole 1 million looks like, but it's still going to have a massive impact on the landscape. And we need to address that. And I think this is what's interesting for me in this country, is that there is a vagueness at the moment here as well. And I still think there's a vagueness in the Netherlands in the respect to this 1 million houses or 800,000 houses. I mean, it changes. One needs to see what 4.4 million houses are in this country. And although England is actually larger, it's still going to have a massive impact. I mean, I'm working on a project at the moment, and this is what I'm talking about, where this 1 million is important. By Utrecht, they're planning in Leidsrijn 30,000 houses. Now, that's not a small amount. That's one thing that we actually had some involvement on. But the other thing is that we've just won a competition for 700 houses, which is not a lot, but it's actually an extension to a village of 1,000 houses. That does a lot. And what's strange is that the gemeente, although I applaud the sort of the city councils or the municipalities within the Netherlands, because they do actually try to engender an investigative approach, which I think doesn't exist here. They are still earmarking these 700 houses for pilots and stewardesses from Schiphol for KLM. So I think there's a lot of contradictions happening, and I think that's where Adriaan Geurze's the impact of that was very profound and should be understood. I think the individual and the collective, again, I think at the moment what I see as a professional architect is that the collective is actually being is being eradicated, in the sense that the collective, especially within building typology, is being sort of left to well, old people housing can have collective.
To what?
Old people housing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the last vestige of collective realm that can actually be brought in within a sort of market-led design. For me, the privatisation of everything is something which I'm seeing. And again, within this with this village extension, I mean, they were talking about, the city council were talking about there being no collective space, and that the sort of the green landscape elements of the site would be borrowed from each other's gardens visually. So there was a complete eradication of any collective or public space, and the privatisation of everything, so that your enjoyment of the specific qualities of that landscape was reduced to actually looking at somebody's garden. So I think there's lots of contradictions, and I think it's very complex. I think we can get a lot from the Dutch situation, especially, and I think it's more about the next question, which is the role of collaboration, which I'm very interested in, and I think Ola Bouwman touched upon it very well in a very interesting way on Tuesday last week here at the AA as well. But maybe I should leave that to...
Maybe we'll just, I think it would be good to open the conversation. Kiss. Maybe you could make a comment in relation to a kind of alternative approach to the kind of thing that maybe Frits was discussing. Would you... Yeah? Maybe we can get a microphone here from...
Well, I think, I don't know whether I'm going to, whether I should say this now or in the afternoon, but...
Both.
Say it twice.
I think Holland is basically an anti-urban society. Yes, I think the Dutch spirit is basically directed towards living in an earthbound house and with a garden. I myself count myself to this category as well. I think that is it has very much to do also with the fact that it used to be a country where which was very rural in the sense of farmers, and at the other side it was an international trading area, so there was a very clear difference. And it has to do with the fact that the country is very small. Everybody is, if somebody works at the end of the country, at night he is at home again. So there's no culture of restaurants, and there's no culture of hotels. So there's a culture of, not a real one, maybe in Amsterdam a little bit. So there is a very housebound culture, and you see that also in the tradition of the development of housing. The Dutch multi-story housing is de facto a pile of row houses put on top of each other in the true spirit of it. So in that sense, you can partly declare this kind of huge quest of wanting to live on the ground, and the closeness of all the cities also give a certain legitimation to it, because for instance the whole discussion of mobility is not really valid. People are always stressing that suburbs are creating an enormous amount of mobility, and that you should try to reduce that and to let people use public transport. But that is completely irrelevant in the Netherlands, because it has been proven that more than 40% of car traffic in Holland is not specifically for work, but is, in other words, useless traffic. It's recreational traffic. And of the work of the functional transport, car transport, a lot of the transport is people who move between cities to do their work, which means that, and also the fact that in Holland everybody, and I mean really everybody, can afford a row house, even you or you, can really afford a row house. You can buy a row house as a property, including the land, in some places for 135,000 guilders, including everything. The fact that you have this mobility system of transport makes living in suburbs, legitimates living in suburbs. So in other words, there are incredible amounts of people who live in a suburb near Gouda, which is a small town near between Utrecht and Rotterdam, of whom the wife works in Amsterdam, the husband works in Rotterdam, and the daughter goes to university in Leiden. And sometimes they have even 3 cars. So this whole idea of compact city is a kind of idea of some people who are having a complete false image of the Dutch culture and of the agglomeration system that we are living in. And I think you can say it is a problem that in a kind of with a large speed, cows are being replaced by dwellings. But on the other hand, it's one of the few countries where the socialist ideal or the American dream, or the average between them, has really been realized in the sense that almost 100% of the population can pick the fruits of it. So for me, it has also a positive side. And what I also notice is that people, this also confirms the statement by Arnold that people in suburbs are no longer dull people that only sleep there and work in the city. This confirms indeed the situation that suburbs are completely urban areas very often, although they don't look like it, because the people are having a kind of urban networks. In many suburbs you have so many social networks that are not confined to the neighborhood where you live. You have about 10 or 15 or 20 rings of circuits of social networks where you are in as an individual, and then all the persons of the family or of the commune have also 10 to 20 rings, so you have at least 30 to 50 different social circuits in every house, if I may, 1,500, if I may exaggerate a little bit. And this leads not to a system of falling apart of the concept of suburb. This also is, in my opinion, is a tendency that confirms the legitimation and the right of existence of a suburb. Because what you see is that people are no longer this electronic cottage idea that it doesn't matter anymore where you live because you have all these networks, doesn't work at all. Because people are so mobile and have so much other communication systems, they're getting an enormous need to have a very concrete residential surroundings for the moments that they can go sit down and rest, and we notice that this produces a need to a real concrete neighborhood environment, which by some urbanists and architects is being translated into regressive urbanism or architecture like Seaside by Duane Plater-Zeeberg or other groups, which in my opinion is not necessarily necessary. But I think that it is a kind of I think by this kind of network life, suburban life is being confirmed.
Thank you. Ken, Paul, would you?
Thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm not a housing specialist. I'm doing a study for 2 research consultancies, Comedia and Demos, on urban living, and we are looking at housing at the moment. And the first thing I say is that it's quite shocking to see how little people who talk about housing plan it and build it have any understanding of social dynamics. I'm thinking, for example, there's a new plan to build a millennium village. This is the new idea on the Greenwich Peninsula. And I think people are thinking hard about how do we achieve social mix, because what we haven't heard this morning is a sense in the Netherlands of the kind of divisive impact of class that continues to kind of create very unstable housing communities in Britain. I mean, only 6 or 7 years ago we had riots in 20 different cities on large white working class housing estates, which are now felt to be completely disconnected from the city. The people do not have jobs, they cannot afford the transport to get into the city. And it's this issue of kind of the disconnection of large amounts of public housing and the failure to kind of produce a social dynamic that makes them work. And we haven't so far seen any evidence of successful social mix in new housing projects in Britain. What you see in London is that when developers want to build 50 houses, 50 units, they go to the local authority gives them permission only if they include 10 units of social housing. The developer says no, and they will pay a fine. They would rather pay a fine than include social housing. And what happens, for example, in Islington is down around Old Street, it's all private housing, and they're paying fines so that Islington Council can build public housing to the north of the borough. So actually we're getting more social polarisation in housing. The second thing is that I think is interesting. If you look particularly around in London or the inner cities, the big cities in Britain, for the middle class, education is now more important than housing. You move housing simply to be near the school. You don't actually choose the house on the basis that this is a nice area to live. It's whether the school's any good. And it'll be very interesting to see in the Millennium Village if they don't actually start with thinking, if we don't produce a fantastic school that will actually enable everybody who lives here to get to university, the middle classes may go to live there, but they will actually send their children away somewhere else to live. So, I mean, it seems to us that unless you understand the dynamic at the moment, I would say, between housing and education, I can't see any possibility in Britain of any new housing working, actually, at all.
Thank you. Thank you. Steve Mullen? Steve, I haven't seen you for 21 years. And it's wonderful to see you back in the building again. Could you give us your reflections on what you've heard this morning?
Follow that, as they say. I was at the presentation of the Greenwich sites of the RIBA a week or so back, and one thing stuck in my mind. One of the speakers behind the winning scheme said they wanted to see no differentiation at all between the public and private sector housing, visually. A little farther on they said, but we want the whole site to change in the natural rhythm of the city. There does seem to me a contradiction in terms between that. We are obsessed by mix. We have been for a long time. It's assumed that socially mixed housing areas are a good thing. I have to say that there is no real evidence for that. Most so-called mixed areas of housing are societies in transition. They're either going up or down the social scale. Areas do live cheek by jowl with each other perfectly happily. Artificial social engineering almost invariably ends in tears, in my experience. The trick is not to stir the pot so that everybody looks the same, but to produce a situation where everybody feels they're getting a fair deal out of the situation. And what has changed, if I may say so, in the last 30 years is that where you used to have public housing as something you aspired to, it is something now you flee from. And the causes of that are not necessarily anything to do with physical design. They have to do with things like where the subsidies go, how dwellings are allocated, what bribes are used to get them in and out of housing. In other words, what I'm saying is, yes, of course, it is a different scene in this country, but it has become a different scene in very recent times. And we ought to look at the causes of that, rather than beat our breasts and look around for ideal solutions. Let us be a little bit more pragmatic and a little less crying woe in the streets.
Maybe make a comment about this issue of social mix. How is it being addressed or not, or in the case of Netherlands?
Yeah, I think Holland has a very strong tradition in the last decades in trying to mix social categories, mainly in the form of building a mix of houses in different price categories. I don't know if that's working. That's the reason that we in Netherlands don't have those kind of riots you spoke about. I think that we don't have them at that scale is more the result of the fact that we on a larger scale than the little neighborhood, or on a larger scale than the housing block, have always had a very mixed city. Because even the areas, in the post-war housing areas, I think are in the Netherlands very integrated in the big cities. They are, in fact, they are seen by developers as potential areas for houses in a very high financial very high sector, villas or something like that. So the locations in the cities and the integration with the system in the city, I think that's in the Netherlands less the problem than it is, I think, in some cities of Great Britain and in cities of France, for example, the banlieue of Paris or other big cities, very isolated, very large complexes were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So when we talk about a mix, I think it's on the basis of a mix, of a city mix, and then you can fine-tune it on mixing in blocks, mixing in neighborhoods, etc. And in the whole question of mixing, I think is far more interesting that, speaking about lifestyles, that lifestyles are a kind of they are breaking through the financial classes, because I think in the social housing projects in the most urban renewal areas in Holland, I know a few architects sitting here who have lived there or are living there still there. So there is a cultural mix in a situation that in fact there is only social housing, and I think that's because those areas are attractive for many people. The migrants, immigrants are living there, but also students and higher schools, but not so high paid professionals. So I think it's always clear to me that in Britain the question of class is always more on the agenda than beyond in Holland. And in Holland we have a certain neiging, what is that? A certain inclination to deny something like class. But I think it's true, still it's true also in England, that lifestyle and class do interfere with each other on a complicated way. And that makes the question of mix complicated but more interesting, I think.
I should like to add on this issue of mix that it's also a question of scale. in the Netherlands, as I mentioned before, public housing is about 35% of the whole housing stock. And in big cities it's much more than that, it's 60 to 70%. And this is related to the history of our housing associations, that they always made a very broad variety of different sorts, types of dwellings, also in terms of price and rent and all that. And at this moment, the debate is, because of this privatization, are the housing associations, have they the possibility in the future to really mix their production and mix their existing housing stock on this point? And they themselves plead for this mixed tradition. They want to build expensive housing besides cheap housing, also because of economic ideas, that they can support their own cheap housing production by building more profitable expensive dwellings.
My question about collaboration, I think, still remains.
May I add one small point?
Don't. Maybe we do it. I'm just trying to think about lunch and getting back for the afternoon and all of that. If there are maybe one or two really important questions that can't wait till the end of the day, that really refer to this morning session specifically, maybe you could either make your comment or raise the question now. Otherwise, we will. No, please. Can you wait for the microphone? Oh, this one.
When you talked about lifestyles.
No, it's on. It's just speak.
When you talked about lifestyles, you did not mention the square meter per person, which you probably is one of the effects of lifestyle. Whether you live as a single or as a single in group or as a family, I mean, that makes a big difference. And I know there's a spread. That's one point. The other point is there has been no mentioning of concerns ecological kind, like sustainable city agenda 2000. Nothing mentioned. I know, is that not a point in Holland? Well,
there were so many points not mentioned.
I think that's public transport. How does it fit with these 1 million in the future?
Is there anyone else who has a critical question? Yeah.
Let's say making a project in Holland is rather complex, so you don't have the three parties being the client, the contractor and the architects deciding what to build, but you have the ecologist of the municipality, you have the urban planning office of the municipality, you have an office of the municipality judging whether your design fits within social housing regulations. You have a traffic engineer, you have urban space designer, so you have at least 8 or up to 10 or 12 parties who design this, and the architect is coincidentally the person who has to bring everything together.
But on the specific question about square footage and transportation, maybe just if there could be a brief response to that.
Yeah, there's an enormous growth of square meters per person since the beginning of the century. This is really one of the most skyrocketing factors in housing analysis. And my expectation is, I think that this will continue for the next few years, ecologically acceptable or not. It will just be an effect of more luxury, more wealth, etc. That the average quantity of square meters a person will continue. This is one of the drives behind this VINEX production, I think.
Thank you. I have to find out from Irene what time we want to get back.
I think
2:30?
we'll reconvene at 2:30, which is just under an hour.
Okay. Thank you. 2:30.